This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with a Democracy Now! Exclusive. We turn now to René González, the only freed member of the Cuban Five. He was released in October of 2011. He returned to Cuba in April of this year after being jailed in the United States for 13 years. I recently spoke to him from Havana via Democracy Now! Video stream. I began by asking him why he came to the United States to investigate militant Cuban exile groups.
Well, for my generation, Cubans, it was part of our development or common experience to have seen people coming from Miami, raiding our shores, shooting at hotels, killing people here in Cuba, blowing up airplanes. So we were really familiar with the terrorist activities that the Cuban people have been suffering for almost 40 years back then. So it wasn't hard for me to accept the mission of going there and monitor the activities of some of those people who had been trained by the CIA in the 60s. Some of them have participated in Bay of Pigs. Some of them had after that, had gone to South America as part of the Operation Condor. And if you look at the history of those people, you can see them linked to the worst actions of the U.S. government, be it the Iran-Contras, even the Kennedy assassination plot was linked to them. So it wasn't hard for me to accept the mission and to go there to protect the Cuban people's lives, and that's what I did.
What were some of the groups that you and your colleagues came to infiltrate? What were their names, and what specifically did you know they were doing in Miami?
Well, if we are talking about that, we should start by Luis Posada Carriles, who's still in Miami. He's living there under the protection of the U.S. government. Posada Carriles has a long story of terrorism against not only Cuba, but also even in the United States. He was responsible for the blowing up of the Cuban airliner in 1976 in Venezuela. And later on, when we were in Miami, he was also organizing the bombs which were placed on the hotels in Havana. But it's not only him. I mean, he doesn't work alone. The sad part is that he was being paid for by the Cuban American National Foundation, which is a legal organization linked to the Washington establishment, an organization which has a lobby in Washington, which has paid for the election campaigns of guys like Ileana Ross or Lincoln Diaz-Balart. And those people were paying these terrorists, that terrorist, to put bombs in Havana in 1997. So that's an example of the whole scheme that we were facing there. And of course, there were some other people like Jose Basulto, who found the brother to the rescue. But before that, he had a long history of terrorism against Cuba. We had Orlando Bosch, who together with Luis Posada Carriles was involved in the plot in Venezuela to blow up the Cuban airliner. And we have, for example, the Novo San Paul brothers, who were linked to the assassination of Orlando Letelier in Washington with the car bomb. So the list is long, but those were the people we were watching on. And that was our mission there.
How did you make it from Cuba to Miami? Explain how you came up.
Well, I was a pilot here in Cuba, so I was flying with the skydiving operations here for sports operations. And well, I took a chance and stole a plane, and I landed in Key West. Of course, I have been born in the United States, so when I landed there, I showed my birth certificate, and then they allowed me to go back to my family's house. And then I ended up with Brothers to the Rescue, which was the first organization that I infiltrated there. And the rest was just linking up with all those people and, you know, going from one group to another to find out their plots against the country.
And what most surprised you about what you found and the linkages of these groups from Brothers to the Rescue? Talk about what Brothers to the Rescue was doing and who was supporting them and what you were reporting back to Cuba.
Well, as I told you, Brothers to the Rescue was founded by, he's a main celebrity, I would say, was Jose Basulto. He was a young guy trained by the CIA during the Bay of Pigs invasion, but he was part of what was called back then the infiltration teams. So it wasn't only him, but a bunch of guys from the infiltration teams, they were the ones who created Brothers to the Rescue. Initially, it was, I would say it was more of a psych-op operation. They tried to incite people to leave Cuba by boats or on rafts, and then they would pretend, let's say they would rescue some of them and make propaganda out of that rescue operations. It was a very intelligent operation because it was premised on a theme that appeals to humanitarian feelings of the people, rescuing rafters, saving lives. And at the beginning, they grew up, out of the support from the people in Miami. But then, after 1995, when the immigration agreements were signed up between Cuba and the United States, they resorted to invading the Cuban airspace, going or flying Havana, launching things. And they started to develop some other plans, which even included the use of some explosives to plant in Cuba. So they became really dangerous. By 1995, they were already trying to do some different things than the ones they had done at the beginning. And, those were the activities I was reporting on.
Can you talk about Basulto talking about a weapon they had to test in the Everglades?
Well, that was presented as evidence on the trial. He devised a weapon which would be like a flare. Let's go back to the beginning, because even when he was saving lives, he called me once and he asked for my advice to introduce some explosives in Cuba. It was in 1992. I'm sorry. His idea back then was to blow up some power lines. Back then in 1992, the economic situation in Cuba was really hard, and we had blackouts every day. So maybe he decided that he could do something to make those blackouts more common. And he was already devising a scheme to introduce in Cuba with his airplanes some explosives to be planted on the power lines. But that was back in 1992. Then after that, he was involved in some plots to buy some leftover military Russian planes. I remember he was trying to buy an L-39, which was a Czechoslovakian military training plane. He was trying to buy a MiG-23, which was a Soviet-built plane. Can you talk about how you came to be arrested in the United States? Well, it's a long process, but I'm going to make it short. By the middle of 1998, there was an opportunity for the two governments, Cuba and the United States, to work together against terrorism. An FBI delegation had visited Havana for some days in June of that year. And before they left Cuba for the United States, they assured the Cuban government that they would do something about the voluminous information that had been given to them on terrorist activities against Cuba, based mainly in Florida. And 3 months after that meeting, all of a sudden things changed, and the FBI raided our homes, and we all were arrested on September 12, 1998. They put us in solitary confinement for a year and a half, and then the whole story started to develop. What was your time in jail like, in prison for 15 years? How were you treated? Well, I would say there were two stages. In Miami, they did everything in their power to break us down. They put us on solitary confinement. They kept us on a hold for a year and a half. They used the conditions of confinement to prevent our access to the evidence of the trial, which is one of the grounds why the United Nations Group on Arbitrary Detentions rejected the trial, by the way, and also Amnesty International. They used my family also to punish me. They didn't allow me to see my daughters for some reason they came up with. And it applied only to me because nobody else on that building had that limitation. So I could say, I wouldn't like to say it, but they were very brutal during our time in Miami. But well, after that, you go, to the normal, when you go to Pennsylvania, you don't know anymore. And that's one of the reasons that we say the trial couldn't be held in Miami, because once you leave Miami, then you are a normal person again.
And where are the other members of the Cuban Five, the four who are still in prison? One about to be released, is that right, in February?
Yes, Fernando, he should finish his sentence in February next year. And I hope he comes right away to Cuba, because he's not a U.S. citizen, so he should be deported from the U.S. And then is Antonio, who is still 4 years away. Ramon is still 11 years away, which is, it would be a crime to keep him in jail. And then Gerardo, who is still dealing with one life sentence.
And where are they all in prison?
Well, they scattered all over the United States. Antonio, he went to the prison where I'm at now, Mariana. Fernando is on Arizona in a prison, in an immigration prison, I believe, low-level prison. Ramon is in Ashland, Kentucky, I believe it is. And Gerardo is in Victorville in California.
What gives you hope that they will be released before their term? I mean, for example, Gerardo is in prison, what is it right now, on 2 life sentences?
Well, my main hope is that the nature of the trial is too murky, is too perverse to withstand the pressure of the best people in the world. I believe that this injustice, this trial is going to go down in history as one of the worst example of what they call U.S. justice. And I hope that the U.S. government, little by little, is going to feel that the weight of this injustice is costing them more than solving the problem. You
were already jailed, because it was in June of 2001 that you were convicted. You were in jail at the time of the 9/11 attacks, right? September 11, 2001. And I'm wondering about your thoughts at the time. I mean, before that, the deadliest airline terrorism in the hemisphere was 1976, was the downing of the Cuban airliner in Venezuela that took out the entire Cuban Olympic fencing team, killed 73 people on board. Ultimately, Posada Calides was convicted in absentia by Panama, who lives in Miami. Your thoughts on what happened then, that kind of what is called terrorism, and where you were in prison?
Well, my first reaction was shock. Of course, nobody can forget that day. I was in my cell, and all of a sudden somebody called me, look at this. And, I just walked out of the cell, and there was a TV set, and the first plane had already hit the first tower. So I was, I thought it was an accident first. So we were talking about that accident, how it happened, whatever. And then all of a sudden I saw the second hit. And I just couldn't believe it. And of course, it was shocking. I was moved by all those. I can never forget those people having to jump from buildings. It's something that you don't wish it happened to anybody. And, the first reaction is just the shock at something so horrible. And then you have to think a little more about that. And what I believe on my allocution to the judge, I talk about it a little bit. I believe that as long as somebody believes that there are some good terrorists and some bad terrorists, terrorism is going to be there. And it's a pity because, as I said to the judge, and you can be a capitalist, you can be a Jew, you can be a Catholic or a Muslim and be a good person. But a terrorist is a sick person, it's not a good person. And for me, the fact that some people, like my prosecutors, for example, believe that some terrorists deserve to be protected and some don't, I mean, I can't believe that in the 21st century this happened yet.
And what was your reaction to those who said that Cuba shooting down the Brothers to the Rescue plane February 24th, 1996, killing 4 members of Brothers to the Rescue, was a terroristic act?
I don't see, I mean, the definition of terrorism doesn't go that far. Terrorism, although I acknowledge the definition is sometimes politically motivated, but my definition is that is the imposition of violence indiscriminately to instill fear among the surviving people. And I don't see how it fits what happens on February 1996. We are talking about a guy who was trained to be a terrorist, who all of a sudden discovered that he's a humanitarian and he creates an organization. He's flying for years in front of the Cuban coast without any incident at all, while he's saving rafters. Cuba doesn't interfere on his activities. And all of a sudden, he decides that he can break into the Cuban airspace, do whatever he wants in Cuba, and he even starts devising plans to introduce explosives in Cuba, to introduce weapons in Cuba, using those planes. And I mean, anybody would accept that defending the country against those actions is an act of sovereignty.
René González, the only freed member of the Cuban Five. He was released October 2011, returned to Cuba last April after being jailed in the United States for 13 years. We're speaking to him in Havana. When we come back, Ricardo Alarcón, former president of the Cuban National Assembly, also Cuba's former foreign minister, will talk about his meetings with the FBI, why Cuba called the FBI to Havana to meet. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.